Alrighty, we are really close to being ready to rock and roll. Just need to get set up with the with Instagram. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's give us just a second here to get this rolling, and then we're going to do this. We are going to, come on, my little phone can do this. I know it can. Okay, there we go. And there we go. Okay. So here we are. Yes. We are just giving Instagram a minute to populate and to get us some people watching us. That'll be fun. And today we are talking about the history of iridology. And we need to talk about this because without knowing the history and knowing what struggles we've been through to get to where we are, how will we ever know where we're going, right? This is one of those cases where we do not want to rewrite history. We want to acknowledge it and acknowledge that it has come from somewhere wonderful and it's going somewhere wonderful as well. So, welcome. I'm glad you're with me. And it's good to have you with me, whether you are with me on the webinar or whether you are actually with me, just want to pop this up, with me on Instagram or on Facebook. We've got so many platforms rolling here. It's lots of fun. My name is Judith Cobb. I'm a master herbalist, a certified iridologist, a certified comprehensive iridology instructor, and a registered nutritional clinical practitioner. So I've got a lot of training under my belt, and not only have I got all those credentials, but I've got 40 years under my belt of practice. I'm going to give you a moment here, and I'm just going to ask you to play with me in my sandbox, if you will. Hi, and I Shining. Good to see you on Instagram. Thanks for being there. And here's what I would like to know. I would like to know if you have any iridology experience already. And I'm doing my best to monitor all the platforms that we're broadcasting on. But if you've got iridology experience already, I would love to know that. Just drop that in the chat box for me. If you do not have any iridology experience, let me know that too. I like to tweak things on the fly. You know, as we go today, we are going to be looking at some eyes. So it's not just going to be history. We're going to be looking at eyes. And hi, Shoshi. It's good to see you on Instagram with us. So I'd like to know if you've got any iridology experience. And I'd like to know what that experience was. Is it constitutional? Is it Jensenian? Is it Dr. Morse? Is it Dr. Pesic? Is it something else? Because that will help me to tweak this presentation on the fly, whoops, to make it more valuable for you. Alrighty, so this would be great if you could just let me know. Hi, F.A. Poor, it's good to see you. Glad you're with us on Instagram. So we need to understand the history here because this science of iridology is still an evolving science. Unfortunately, some people think it got stuck about 50 years ago, but there's been some really great research since then that has been corroborated. It's been reproduced. There's some great science happening behind this science. And so we want to be aware that this is a science that has not finished its job yet. It's not done. It's nowhere near done. And we want to know where it's going. We want to know where we've come from. And we need to know that we've got to keep moving forward with this. We know that anciently, iridology was practiced on some level in Egypt, India, China, and Greece. But we know that it has evolved since then. I mean, way back then, some people thought the world was flat. We know it's not flat now. We know that all good science does continue to evolve. If we used the medical science of 150 years ago, where would we be? Right? We need to evolve the science. We need to let it grow. We need to do the research, and we need to keep moving forward. All good scientists grow with their science, right? And that is really important. So let's look at the very earliest roots that we think we know of. And so the first one here is the owl story. Now, this is a story that is highly disputed, and I'm going to add to that little bit of a disputation here, because the story goes that Ignaz von Petzschley, who later did become a medical doctor, was an 11-year-old boy in Budapest. And the story from there gets really garbled. Some people say he caught an owl, some say it was a hawk, some say it was a falcon. Some say the owl, the bird, had a broken leg or a broken wing to begin with. Some say it got broken while Ignaz was busy trying to capture him. And from there it goes that Ignaz saw a black line forming in the owl's eye, and that as he captured this owl and kept it in captivity for a while and nursed it back to health, that the black line disappeared. So the question that we have to ask is, wild birds, especially birds of prey, tend to be quite aggressive. They don't tend to be very friendly. How did an 11-year-old boy ever capture this bird? And how did he get this bird to sit still long enough so he could actually see its eyes? We also have to ask the question, and this is an important one, what was going on in that owl's eyes? Because an owl's iris and eye structure is very different from a human's eye structure. When we look at a bird iris, it does not have the same layers that a human iris does. And so we can't say that he saw this or that he didn't, but you would think that if a black line had shown up anywhere in this bird's eye, that veterinarians since then would have noticed the same thing, right? I mean, think of how many different rescue, especially bird of prey rescue facilities there are, even just in North America, right? They would have noticed a similar thing, but no one has ever commented on that. And that just seems a little strange to me. So what we want to be aware of here is that the very most important thing is that Ignaz saw something, or thought he saw something, that made him wonder. It made him curious, and it's what led him to start doing some research about this. And for that, we are ever so grateful. This is a quote from Ellen Tart Jensen's book, and she says this, and Ellen Tart Jensen is the daughter-in-law of the very famous Bernard Jensen. Ellen says, even August von Petzschley recognized years later that Ignaz was looking at an owl's eye and not that of a human, and that he did not have proper equipment to prove what had been recorded in stories. It is time for iridology to move forward based on sound research rather than hearsay. And I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. Now, again, to Ignaz's credit, he did become a medical doctor. He did begin with a 2-power magnifying glass, which this is just incredible to me. He began mapping out the iris. As a medical doctor, he would look at what was wrong with his patient, and then he would draw what he saw in the eye, and he began to create a rudimentary map of the different reaction fields in the iris. And for that, we are ever so grateful. He had one challenge, though. And that challenge was that he could not understand why a group of people who had all the similar symptoms didn't have the same markings in their eyes. And why some people who had this type of particular marking in their eye, why they didn't all have the same symptoms. That kind of tripped him up, and it got him a little bit frustrated, which I think it would frustrate anybody. What he didn't know then, and what we do know now, is that what we see in the iris is inherent. Not all of the symptoms we experience are inherent, right? So what we see in the iris has a genetic root, but all of our symptoms aren't based in genes. So then we move forward to Pastor Nil Liljeqvist. Now, it's really interesting that so many of these early iridology researchers were actually pastors. They had that religious base, which is very, very interesting. So he lived from the mid-1800s to early 1900s. He correctly identified that the way the fiber is sitting in the eye tells us how resilient a person's health inherently is programmed to be. And so what that means is that he correctly deduced that when we see an eye that has lots of really tightly woven fiber in it, like the eye on the left of your screen, that this person typically will resist disease more effectively, will rebound from disease more quickly and strongly, whereas someone who has an eye like the one you see on the right-hand side, where the fiber structure is more open, it's a little more loose, these people have a lower resiliency, and they may have to work harder to stay well. They may have to work harder to get well. Now, he was the origin of the idea that the eyes would change due to toxic exposures. So if someone had a heavy metal exposure, if they'd taken a lot of medications, that their eyes would change because of that. Now, what we understand now is that that is not correct. We now understand that melanin is the pigment that is responsible for many of the little freckles we see in an eye, and that these are inherently predisposed as well. They are not the result of toxic exposure. And so we cannot then cleanse these out of the eye, which is what so many people are teaching, is that you can cleanse freckles out of the eye. Then we come up to Pastor Emanuel Falca. He lived at about the same time that Pastor Neil Lilliquist did. Now, I want you to remember, these people didn't live in the same city. They didn't know who was doing research or if anybody else was doing research at all. They certainly didn't have the internet to share their notes on, right? And so we've got these people in different areas in Europe, all on that same wavelength of, I wonder if the eyes can give us information about a person's health. I love that kind of serendipity, that kind of energy where people are on the same wavelength. So Pastor Emanuel Falca also started mapping out an iris, and he started laying the foundation again for others to build what we now call constitutions on. He also taught iridology, and there is still to this day in Germany an institute called the Falca Institute, which teaches iridology. So that's pretty cool. So we've got a couple of different iris maps being developed at this period in history, which I think is just very exciting. And it corroborates the concept. If you've got a lot of people thinking the exact same thought and going in the exact same direction, and yet they are not conferencing together, it really, for me, indicates that they're onto something that's good. They're onto something that is valid. Then we have Rudolf Schnabel, who again lived those late 1800s into the mid 1900s, which sounds so long ago now. He really studied the freckles or the pigments in the eye. He studied the pupil tonus, so the size and shape of the pupil and what it means to a person's health. How much of it is genetic? How much of it is situational? Things like that. He was one of the very first people to actually use a microscope to look at an iris. And now, of course, eye doctors use a slit lamp microscope all the time, and some iridologists also have that. He went on to say, and I absolutely love this because I agree with him 100%, it was no easy task, and those who believe or would like to believe that handling iridoscopy, or iridology as we call it now, can be learned within a few weeks or even days are mistaken and do a disservice to a good cause. Now, I really believe that, because in order to learn iridology well, you don't just learn the markings. You don't just learn what a marking looks like and one meaning for it. Because when you really understand iridology, you understand that you have to combine markings. We call it triangulation. So you don't ever use just one marking as an indicator. I mean, medical people don't either, right? If you've got a fever, they don't name a disease from a fever, do they? If you've got a fever, they want to know, is there a rash? Is there mucus congestion? Is there any inflammation anywhere in the body? And they go down a long list before they come up with what they would consider a diagnosis. In iridology, just the same, we need more than one iris marker before we start understanding the person and their physiology and their chemistry. So we always want more than one marker. Then we have Joseph Ungerer. He lived in the 1900s, so he's coming a little more current, again in Germany. These people are all in Central Europe, which is very exciting. He was a student of Schnabel's. And so he was studying iridology with Schnabel, and he also became a naturopath, which is not an uncommon combination to have naturopaths who are certified iridologists, very common in this day and age. He was really concerned that every iridologist who had been doing research was creating their own verbiage, their own language, their own way of describing things, and it was leading to confusion. It was like having Italian, German, French, and Spanish, and maybe let's throw in some Navajo, and trying to get them to communicate, and it wasn't working very well. He wanted to unify it. He wanted everyone to call a particular marking by the same name instead of everybody having their own name for that marking. And he felt that that would really help to do several things, one of which was to unify the forward movement of iridology, but also to help us understand each other better. He knew his students were reading books that had been published and accepting whatever was in print as gospel true. But he also knew that many of those books had not actually been validated, that it was one person writing from a limited experience, publishing a book, and there wasn't a lot of substance behind what those authors were saying. So for him, his own research, as he continued to research and develop iridology, he refused to publish his work until it had been analyzed and reviewed by his peers. He wanted to make sure that his research and what he was teaching would stand the test, that it would be proven strong and good. Then we have Joseph Deck, again in the 1900s, again in Germany. He was also a dedicated iridology researcher, and he pioneered photography for iridology, and photography has come such a long way. I actually do an entirely separate presentation on iridology photography because it is critical to doing a good iris assessment. Joseph Deck was also an instructor, and he wrote one of the books that led to iridology being brought, constitutional iridology being brought to North America. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Then we have another German, Theodor Krieger. He was a student of Ungerer, Deck, and Schnabel. So he had three really, really strong teachers. And he felt that iridology was the #1 assessment tool, but that it was best used with other assessment tools as well. So he often suggested doing urine testing, doing fingernail testing, doing a tongue assessment like they do in traditional Chinese medicine, studying the feces. He wanted things to corroborate and blend with what he was seeing in a person's eyes. In 1962, he said, "I hope that a later generation will succeed in establishing a single uniform system. In spite of zealous efforts, these have so far not succeeded." So he also wanted to unify iridology, and that would make it more solid, wouldn't it? Other than having all of these different philosophies that are going in different directions, many of which don't have good scientific basis behind them, he wanted everyone to be unified, to come together, and to be on the same page. Then we have our American roots, and many of you will be familiar with Bernard Jensen, whom we greatly revere. We love Dr. Jensen. If it were not for him, iridology would have died in North America. Although it has progressed from where he had it, it would have died because during the Cold War years, when there was no communication between Europe and particularly Germany and North America, Bernard kept working with what he knew. What he knew was the best he had. As we look back, it was not complete. It was in many ways flawed, but because of his passion, he was able to keep iridology alive in North America, and we are ever so grateful to him for that. Then we have Harry Wolfe in about 1980 moving forward. Harry was an American-born German. He read and spoke German. He got his hands on the book by Joseph Deck, on one of the books by Joseph Deck, and started studying that. He was very enthralled with it, and it made sense to him. So he began teaching it, and shortly thereafter, Bill Caradonna joined forces with him. Now, Bill started out as a registered pharmacist, but he was getting frustrated with the fact that people who came into his pharmacy kept coming in for the same drugs or stronger and stronger drugs, and they weren't getting better. So as Bill started working with Harry and teaching and progressing iridology, he then later became a naturopath. Now, Bill Caradonna is my constitutional teacher, and I met him 30 years ago. My previous teachings before that were Jensenian for 10 years. So 10 years of Jensen and 30 years of constitutional. And in the last couple of years, I've been privileged to actually connect up with Harry Wolfe and to be spending some time with him online, which is very cool. So now what we've got with Harry and Bill is iridology progressing forward from what Bernard Jensen kept alive into constitutional iridology. So let's take a quick look at the styles of iridology that are current in North America. We've got Jensenian. So these are the people who have studied with Jensen or one of his students, one of his iridology descendants, if you will, and they hold fast to the things that he taught. We have Rayid, or emotional iridology, also known as behavioral iridology, which was founded by Denny Johnson. He looks at the eyes and says that the markings that we see tell us, they teach us about the emotional gifts and challenges that a person might have. So they're gifts and what he would call their lessons. That work has been progressed by Jim Burgess, as he now works with what he calls behavioral iridology. And then we have constitutional iridology. So let's look at each of these a little bit more closely to see what they offer and how they might be different from one another. Jensenian iridology was originally taught by Bernard Jensen, and he taught that the iris changes when the body changes, that healing lines and lacunae shape and size all change. He says that he taught that, and what we know is that traditional Jensenian iridologists often have done iris readings cold with no background information. Now, this is a little bit dicey because these readings, and I know there are some iridologists here in my city who have done it this way. You go into their office, you sit down, they don't even want you to say a word. They will literally shush you. They want to tell you what they see, what it means, stop at the front desk, buy your $300 worth of supplements and come back in 2 weeks. And so done very, very cold with no background information. Traditional Jensenian iridologists have a very different style from modern Jensenian iridologists, because the modern ones have studied with Ellen Tart Jensen, and she has moved forward to update iridology to be constitutional with what she teaches. Rayid iridology teaches that emotional traits are genetic and are revealed by markings in the irides. And so this is interesting that we've got now 2 different ways of interpreting the eye, one that's physical, one that's emotional. Readings may be done cold, and information gathered from the irides may be combined with personal and or family history information for interpretation. This is very interesting. The first time I ever experienced Rayid would have been about 25 years ago. I was taking a Rayid class, and I had an iridology camera and was shooting eye slides at the time. So I asked the teacher if she would like to do a class study on a family. And she said, yeah, that'd be great. And at the time we had 5 children. And so I had eye slides of myself, my husband, and our 5 children, including a 6-year-old infant. She looked at my husband's eyes and my eyes, and she told me things about my husband she could not have known about his personality, things that she would not have known about me. And then she went through each of our children and was able to pinpoint some of their gifts from their eyes. And it was very fascinating because she was spot on. Again, the RAID, or the behavioral, was founded by Denny Johnson, and it's continued on by Jim Burgess. Now, Denny Johnson has actually totally changed RAID from what it was 35 years ago. Totally changed, very, very different now, which is very interesting how he has continued to develop what he was doing for research. When we look at constitutional iridology, again, this originated with Joseph Deck and others. It really originated with the German researchers, those Central European researchers. We know that constitutional iridology is used by medical doctors in Italy, Germany, and Russia. And we know that correlative medical studies are being done, that there's research going on in California right now with a naturopath who is using 23andMe to correlate specific things to the eyes, and he's having tremendous success, which is very exciting. And he shares bits and pieces of what he's learning as he feels that it's established strongly enough. Constitutional teaches that the eyes are a reflection of genetic structure of the body, not of things that are currently going on, but of the genetic structure. And constitutional is the foundation of what I teach as dynamic iridology. Constitutional iridology does not give us the answers, but it tells us what questions to ask. So as a Jensenian iridologist, I would look at an eye and I would say, you have, you have, you have. And my clients would go, no, 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 because most of my clientele was very young. Most of them were in their 20s. I was in my 20s. I was attracting my age group. Now, as I'm older, I look at their eyes and I say, your eyes suggest this, this, and this. And as they're in their 50s and 60s now, they're agreeing that, yes, they have that, but they didn't when they were younger. And so this is really important. With constitutional, we look at an eye and we say things like, your eyes suggest there's an increased risk of this, this, and this. Is there a personal or family history of those things? Right? So it gives us the leeway to ask the questions, to have a conversation with our clients, and to really understand where they're at in time and space and what their risks are. Other iris and sclera changes may continue to become visible with time, and these changes may reveal areas that need support. Now, these changes aren't happening because the person is mistreating their body, not happening because they've done these massive cleanses, but the changes that we are seeing in their eyes are, again, inherently programmed. And so when we see maybe pigment coming up in the eye, for instance, we know that something is activating, that something has genetically been triggered, and that we want to get in there and work on it to stall that process. Background information is very important to us. We don't do readings cold. We want to know who we're working with. So my journey with iridology, and I just want to share this with you because I want you to know that I'm not a fly-by-night operator here. Here's how it goes. I started learning iridology in 1979 when I was young, and then my hair hadn't started to turn gray yet. And constitutional iridology was just in its infancy in North America. It certainly had not reached Canada yet. Wasn't even widespread in the US. And so my original teachings were all Jensenian. I had several teachers who were first generation Jensenian students, and I studied with these people because they were accessible to me where I live. And I embraced that work and I just dug into it wholeheartedly and loved it. But after about 5 years, I started to have some questions. I was a master herbalist, I was working with nutrition, and I was putting my clients, based on their eyes, on cleanses, promising them their eyes would change, that their eye color would change, that the freckles would go away, telling them that those sort of hazily eyes should be blue. And as we did all this work, I didn't see any changes. I kept hanging on. I hung on for a total of about 10 years. And that's when I finally thought, I just have to leave this behind. It is not working. I'm not getting the changes I was promised I would see. My clients are losing faith in what I do. I can't do this. So just as I was about to walk away, I was blessed to learn about constitutional iridology. But I would see as a Jensenian, I would see eyes like this, and I would tell my people that each one of these little circular leaf-shaped things was a current pathological problem. If we did the right things, these things would disappear. These leaves would go away. We would see this fogging and this clouding that's over here. It would go away. It would clean up. It would become nice and blue. But I didn't see it. I was told that these lines inside here, inside these spaces, were healing lines, but I had nothing to compare to. I was told that these lines had developed because this person was healing that area, but we didn't have a before picture from 5 or 10 years ago to see if these lines were there before or not. But as I gathered pictures over the years of people, these lines didn't change. They weren't really healing lines. I was told that an eye like this that had such uneven pigment or that had freckles in it meant that that body was full of toxins, that they needed to cleanse, that if we cleansed really hard, we could turn this murky eye blue. And I had seen pictures in books where they showed before and after pictures. And then it was revealed that some of those authors had, well, all of the authors had monkeyed with things. And what I mean by that is some of them had used color filters. So they did the before picture, they were up against the publishing deadline. They took a picture with a color filter to show what they thought would happen. And they claimed that it was before and after. There's examples where in textbooks where people have said, this is a before and this is an after. And when you look at them, they're actually not even the same person when you examine the structure, not even the same person. And so I began to get really, really frustrated. You know, I saw things that I thought were right. I saw things that I thought were accurate. I saw what I thought was pupils changing size. Well, of course they did. Pupils change size in response, first off, to the light in the room, and second off to the nervous system. They change shape and size, or they change size especially, all the time. But in many respects, these were actually the results of the technology being used. So my frustration was growing. I was finding this wasn't working in my practice, and I needed something different, or I just needed to walk away from it. So when I learned about constitutional iridology, this is way back before the internet. Like we're talking, like I said, the 1980s, right? The internet was maybe in its infancy, but I certainly didn't have access to it. But I learned about Harry Wolfe. I learned that he had some videotapes, some VHS videotapes, and you may not even know what a VHS videotape is. I ordered them. And I reviewed those videotapes, played them over and over again, took notes, stopped, studied, played them, and really worked through this with a fine-tooth comb. And what he was saying made sense. He was talking about predispositions being passed down, predispositions being genetic and inherited, that what we see in the iris is inherent, that the eye shows us where the strengths and the weaknesses are, or the areas that are really robust and the areas that need nurturing. He taught that pigment is not an accumulation of toxins, but that it shows us again where there are predispositions to things that don't want to work right. That the color of a pigment tells us which organ wants to cause stress. The placement of the pigment tells us which organ is going to have to really deal with the fallout of that stress. So the pigment teaches us about imbalances. He also taught that we cannot cleanse pigments out. Constitutional iridology teaches us to look for patterns. It teaches us to understand the interrelationship of organs and how organs impact each other. And it teaches us that if a person is already doing the things that they need to do to support their health, there's a good chance that even if we see markings in the eyes, that person will not exhibit symptoms of imbalance because they're controlling those symptoms. They're controlling how their body works by nurturing it properly. But that doesn't erase the inherent predisposition. The old iridology would say, so let's just do this as a quick little analysis. So doing the old style of iridology would say that we know that this is the eye of an Asian woman in her mid-30s, and her concern is that she was struggling to get fertile and to be fertile, to have a baby. And the old iridology would have said, oh my goodness, you know, you've got all kinds of parasites. We need to clean out those parasites. You are either headed into or coming out of a nervous breakdown. You have circulatory blockages happening, particularly in your brain. Do you see where that goes, where you're telling them what's wrong? This is the analysis I actually did with this client. This is what it actually looks like. She's got contraction furrows. Now, these suggest that she burns through her B vitamins, vitamin C, calcium, and magnesium really, really quickly. But I also saw some other markings with the way the pigment is sitting that suggests she doesn't methylate her Bs properly. So I asked her if she was taking folic acid, and she said yes, and we got that tested, and her folic acid came out really weird. It came out really high, which is an indication that she was using an unmethylated one that wasn't being methylated properly, and it was accumulating, and that's not good when you're trying to get pregnant, because it was a form she couldn't use biologically. I also suspected from this haze up here that she had an issue with some liver enzymes, and that she might have problems handling her carbohydrates properly. So that made me wonder, with being infertile, of course, what her cycles were doing. Well, her menstrual cycles were averaging 90 days, which is a key indicator of polycystic ovarian syndrome. But when I see that, when I suspect that she's not handling her carbs properly, and that she's not methylating her Bs properly, it leads me to wonder, does she have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes? And could she have polycystic ovarian syndrome? So I asked her those questions, and she said, oh yes, my doctor has said that already. And I'm giving my head a shake going, well, why didn't you say that when I said, what do you need help with? Because she didn't understand clearly that they would have such an impact. Her medical doctor had not given her any information about diet or about supplements or about methylated Bs. Doctor didn't even know about the methylated B side of things. So we crafted a diet for her to get rid of the carbs and to get her onto complex carbs and proteins and good fats. We got the methylated Bs going in. We got her menstrual cycles down to between 32 and 35 days. It took her a few months, quite a few months, but then she conceived and she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy in a 3-hour labor and delivery. The doctors were just astonished. So I could not have arrived at those understandings of wondering if she was type 2 diabetic, polycystic ovarian syndrome, MTHFR defect, if I didn't understand constitutional iridology. If I had gone with the old school iridology, I would have never been able to help her get pregnant. But because I understood those things from what I saw in her eye, I could ask her the questions and then help her craft her program. And they were very excited about that, as anybody who's been trying to get pregnant for 3 or 4 years would be. So what do I think the future of iridology is? It's a good question. As long as there is good research being done, and as long as iridology instructors are willing to adopt that good research and teach it and help to sustain the forward progression of iridology, I think iridology will begin to gain respect as a valid health assessment tool. Notice I didn't say diagnostic tool, because we never name diseases from looking at the eyes. If, however, we as an iridology community insist on hanging on to old, outdated, disproved concepts, we will continue to be relegated to that category of quackery. We will never gain the recognition that we should have, and we will never be able to do the full amount of good that we could do. So the choice is really ours, right? To either get current and stay current, or to fall behind and not be of any service to anyone really in the long run. So I'm just going to drop a 30-second bit of information here about an upcoming course in iridology. It's the one that I teach, called Confident Nutritionist Dynamic Iridology. The course will be starting on Thursday, July 30th. It runs for 22-hour-long sessions from 5 p.m. till 7 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Registration isn't quite open yet. It will be opening very, very soon. If you would like more information about this course, which teaches all of the curriculum and has all of the necessary mentoring for people to certify with the International Iridology Practitioners Association, if they would like to, then just hop on over to iridology.education. When that little pop-up thing comes up that says, do you want to download an iris map? Go ahead and opt in for that. That will add you to my email database so that I can send you emails letting you know when the iridology course, when Confident Nutritionist will be opening for registration. So when we look at this again, we just need to be aware that we need to be teaching current information. We need to let go of the past. We need to understand the past and move forward with new research. So that is the history of iridology. Thank you so much for being with me. And I'm just watching to see some things. Oh, and this is great. Matthew Dahmer, who has created, he's with me on Facebook right now. He created the Iris Explorer, which is a beautiful imaging setup for the eyes. And he says, iris colors also seem to change when you take a photo when the camera doesn't block out surrounding light. Yes, 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 yes. Also changes if you're not regulating your camera settings properly, right? And so we need to be, like I said, I teach an entire webinar just on photography and imaging techniques for iridology as well, because it is critical. If you're going to be taken seriously, you need to know how to do good imaging, right? You need to have consistency in your variables rather than having variance in your variables. And so Matthew, thank you for weighing in on that on the Facebook page. That's wonderful. So that's all I have for you today. And F.A. Poor on Instagram says, thanks, it was really great. So glad you enjoyed it. Glad you were with me. And I look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Take care and have a great weekend. Bye for now.